This video is about Edward Said. Why is he so famous? What is the most interesting theme in his writings? And why didn't he write about the Arab world? Let's start with the first one. Why is Edward Said so famous? Edward was a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University. He was also an accomplished musician, a pianist. He wrote tens of very important essays published in leading newspapers and publications the world over. He had many books. He had several documentaries. But in the late 1970s, he wrote his most important book, Orientalism. Orientalism was a critique by Edward Said of the writings of Western politicians, explorers, writers, commentators, novelists about the Orient, about parts of Africa, the Arab world, parts of Asia, the Indian subcontinent. And the main critique of Edward Said was that not that they wrote condescendingly, not that they depicted these parts of the world as very much lagging behind, which was the truth, but that they reflected their own misconceptions and misconceptions they inherited from previous generations, even fantasies about these parts of the world on the Orient in their writings. And that these misconceptions, these fantasies, gradually became the narrative in the West about the Orient. And not just the narrative, it shaped the mindset in the West regarding the Orient. And importantly, all of that shaped the policies that the West adopted towards the Orient, towards Africa, towards Asia. And the most important policy, of course, was colonialization. All of this happened at a time, so late 1970s, throughout the 80s, early 1990s, in a period in which, primarily in the US, but also in England and to some extent in parts of Europe, such as France, but to some extent, there were many debates and many discussions about the notion of the empire, the Western Empire in the East, in the Orient, British Empire, the French Empire, and there were many criticisms, many revisiting to different episodes in history and trying to look at them from different perspectives. Here, Orientalism and the contribution of Edward Said became of immense importance, because Edward Said did not just put forward his ideas, he put so many examples and substantiations to strengthen the argument he presented. And that's why his ideas gained massive ground. It changed the discipline of critiquing old ideas, old texts from the 18th, 19th, early 20th century, and spilled over the success of Orientalism from that discipline to sociology, to political science, to area studies, Middle Eastern studies, Indian subcontinent studies, African studies. And his ideas spilled over from academia to the media, to politics, to public affairs in general. One can very easily argue that the narrative about the relationship between the East and the West changed massively after the publication of Orientalism. Because of that, to a large extent, Edward Said became the voice in the West of the previously colonized. And that's why his prominence quickly moved from being an academic, a professor, to being some sort of a representative of ideas from the East, from the Indian subcontinent, from Africa, and of course from the Arab world in the West about the discussion regarding the history of the interaction between the West and the Orient. So he whether he liked it or not, whether he embraced it or not, he became some sort of a representative of the voice of those who were previously colonized in the discussions, in the debates with the West and in the West. The other reason Edward Said became very successful was that he, since the early 1970s, was a Palestinian activist or a voice for the Palestinian cause, primarily in the United States, but to some extent in Europe as well. But the success of Orientalism and the prominence that Edward got out of that gave him fame, gave him gravitas, and he was a very eloquent man with a beautiful way of presenting his ideas, primarily in English, but also to a large extent in French. He had a colossal knowledge of the culture, the history, the societies of the West, which meant all of this together that he gave the Palestinian voice in the West a new form, a new way of expression, which allowed the Palestinian voice to enter smoothly into very prestigious and often influential circles in academia, in media, that the Palestinian voice had never before entered. This is why you find many people who say that the most important theme in the writings of Edward Said is that about the Palestinian cause. Some people would say the most important contribution was Orientalism. And you'll find many different views because Edward Said's oeuvre is very rich. But I think that there's one particular theme that is very recurring in his writings, and that is exile, being an exile. Edward was a Palestinian who grew up in Cairo. He vacationed in Mount Lebanon. He went to school in a very prestigious English school, very detached from its environment in Cairo. After that, he went to university in New England, in the northeastern part of the United States, and then he settled in New York. And in every one of these places, he was an outsider. And it's not a coincidence that the most important book he wrote about the formative years of his life, he titled Out of Place. And the meaning is that he felt out of place in every phase of those in his life. And I think if there's one thing that flies in front of any reader of that book is the sense of belonging, or the lack thereof, that there is no belonging that he felt in any of these places, in any of those phases of his life. And that's why there is always a duality in the thinking of Edward Said. So you see that he's a professor, but he's an activist. He's a very analytical man, but he's an artist, a musician. He is an American, but a Palestinian. He is Western, but also Arab. And I think this duality in his multiple identities is the main reason why he did not write really in depth and seriously about the Arab world. I think that as a very sophisticated man and very sensitive man, after 35, 40 years in the West, having acquired a lot inside him of the Western culture, Western views of the world, Western identity, I think he felt that he is not entitled to write about the Arab world, to write the book about the Arab world, to hold the pen about that part of the world. I also think there was a political reason why he didn't write. Edward was very angry about developments in the Arab world, political developments in the Arab world in the 1980s and 1990s. But because he was a very prominent figure by that time in the West, if he had written most likely what he would have written about the Arab world would have been used against the Arabs in the West. And of course, he was very aware of that. And I think he did not want that to happen. Perhaps there was also sadness in him towards the Arab world, or about the Arab world. Edward grew up in 1940s, 1950s Cairo, which was very beautiful and liberal and cosmopolitan and open to the world. And of course, by the 1980s, by the 1990s, Cairo has lost all of that. He vacationed in Mount Lebanon, which also in the 1940s, 1950s, was very beautiful and peaceful and portrayed an image of almost being a sacred place. And of course, by the 1980s, Lebanon and Mount Lebanon was devastated by a bloody, vicious civil war. So I think there was a sadness inside of him about the complete loss of the Arab world that he knew and lived in, and that he was, if he would have written about the Arab world, he would have poured out not just anger, but also sadness. And I think he didn't want to do that. Also, the last decade of his life was a difficult one for him. He was dying of a rare type of cancer. He negotiated with his mind, his circumstances, his heart, if you'd like, amidst two difficult love stories. And I think the sense of exile and self-exile had exacted a lot of costs on him internally. And I think amidst all of that in the last decade of his life, he probably was trying to reconcile all of that internally and giving priority to this, as opposed to filling the voids in his oeuvre, including writing about the Arab world. And yet, despite that, I think that his major contributions, his many writings, the richness of his ideas, and a number of his books with the details about them and the analyses in them, give us, whether we are Arabs or people who are concerned and about the Arab world or follow the Arab world, give us a lot of tools to use to fill that gap, to reflect about that period in the history of the Arab world through the reflections of Edward Said.